First thing I'd like to do is approval of the minutes from January 21st. You should have it in an email. So if there are any objections, please let me know. If not, I will consider them approved. Not seeing anything, the minutes are approved from January 21st. Can you hear me back there okay? It just sounds like it's not coming out. Okay. At this point, I believe this is the last day for this committee as far as accepting individual bill requests. Is that a correct statement, Mr. Reviser?
So the committee, let me get my calendar out real fast, Mr. Chairman. Because I want all legislators and folks in the building to know these dates. So you are correct that Monday, the January 27th, is the last day for individual members to request member-sponsored bills. What that means is if your individual name or co-sponsors are going to be on the bill, you need to get with us, the revisor's office, and request that that measure with us by 5:00 p.m. on Monday, the 27th. For our committee requests, Mr. Chairman, the day we're looking at is February the 3rd. So that will be the last day that committees can accept folks coming and requesting an RS number for sponsorship by the committee. So Monday, February the 3rd is the date we're looking at.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it. Any questions on that? Don't see any. So at this point, do we have any requests for bill introductions? Ms. Lucas, welcome to the committee. You have the microphone.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. With your permission, would request Jessica Lucas on behalf of the Clean Energy Business Council with introduction of RS 0255, and this is an act pertaining to the parallel generation statute.
All right. Committee, any questions on RS 0255? Are there any objections? All right. Bill has been introduced. Thank you. Any further bill introductions? Not seeing any. We will move on then. Excuse me just a second. There we go. First up is a presentation on coal in Kansas. And we've got Mr. Randy Eminger here, who has spent 42 years representing the electric power industry. He started his career as the government affairs for Southwest Public Service, an electric utility covering parts of Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas. And when I first seen his picture on here, it's like, okay, I know the individual. Mr. Carmichael, do you know who this is? I did not put the connection together. So we met each other in Gillette, Wyoming, what, 2 years ago?
2 years ago, yep.
2 years ago.
2020.
So, and we toured one of the really big, was it the biggest mine in the country?
Biggest it's the biggest surface mine in North America.
In North America, yeah. Very interesting tour. So, but anyway, welcome to the committee. Take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. I appreciate being here. After 4 years of the last administration and then 8 years under Obama, we took quite a beating. As you can imagine, I represent the state of Wyoming and National Mining Association out of Washington, D.C. I have been in the industry for a long time. It's the electric utility that I was in charge of governmental affairs. Had one small piece of Kansas, which was a liberal Kansas. We were headquartered out of Amarillo, Texas, but we had a little bit of Kansas in our service territory. But I've been doing it a long time. You wouldn't believe I'm only 45 years old. That's what being in this industry has done to me. But I'm glad to be here. Thank you. I'll try to keep it short. I just want to bring a little message about the importance of coal-based generation in the state of Kansas. And I've done this in a number of states throughout the Midwest. I'll talk a little bit about electric reliability and where the state stands. Let's see. So I'd start off with just in Kansas, and a lot of this is just basic information that I'm sure a lot of you know, but A decade ago, about 58% of your electric generating capacity in the state was coal-based, and about 22% was wind energy. And in 2023, now you see about 47%, or almost half, of the electric generation capacity in the state is wind generation. 28% is coal, 8% natural gas, and 18% is your nuclear capacity that you have in the state currently. The same trend has been taking place throughout the U.S. and in the Southwest Power Pool. As most all of you know, you belong to a regional power pool which runs through 14 states throughout the Midwest, primarily from the Dakotas down through Louisiana and Texas. In that area, you can see from this chart, basically back in 2012, coal was 59% of the generation in that region. Today, it's 27%. And you'll see the wind, which is the green line, which has gone up dramatically over the last 12, 13 years. So the trend has been pretty well the same across the entire region of the Southwest Power Pool. I pulled this off of the website of the Kansas Corporation Commission just to show you that last year, or last fiscal year, I guess, 2023 through July 30th of 2024, about 50% of your electricity, actual electric generation, 51% came from wind. Again, coal's 28% of your generating capacity. It generated about 24% of the electricity in the state that year. One thing to note, I would say, on different types of generation, and Southwest Power Pool ranks all of the generation by its capacity factors. In other words, what's the average amount of electricity that we can expect from a nuclear plant, a coal plant, a gas plant, wind, solar. This is basically what they have currently in 2024. You'll note that the average for gas and coals is about 65 to 70% of the time it can run at full capacity. You can start or stop. Of course, the one that's the highest capacity is nuclear. You'll see at 95%. Then again, solar and wind is seasonal. So you'll find, for instance, solar in the fall is really the time, fall and winter, when you have more clouds, you have longer nighttime, so you end up with less capacity factor. And with the wind, it's summertime when the wind doesn't blow as much. So that kind of shows you a little bit of the capacity factors, the ability to generate electricity during those different seasons. In the Southwest Power Pool, I just pulled this up from a couple of days ago to kind of look at what the generation mix was. And you'll see that coal was 42% of the electric generation for most of that day. You'll find natural gas was 23%, and then wind ran about 28%, which is the green on the top level of that. Natural gas is the blue, and then the tan or the orange is the coal generation that from 2 days ago. What we're seeing nationwide, and this is from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is the federal agency in charge of electric reliability across the U.S. The new chairman is Mark Christie. He stated last year on a FERC panel before Congress that power plants are retiring much faster than they're being replaced. And just basically say the arithmetic's not working. We're not building as quickly as we're closing plants. Chairman Willie Phillips on the commission, who was appointed by Biden, also said we're facing unprecedented challenges to reliability over our national electric system. And so we're seeing that even from the very top, those looking at electric reliability have concerns. This map just came out in December. last month. It was a study by the NERC, the North American Electric Reliability. We have FERC, we have NERC, we have all these federal acronyms that are trying to catch up on. But the North American Electric Reliability Corporation is charged with looking at doing the research on electric reliability for the U.S., for all of North America. And you'll see the red section, which is the MISO region, which is to the east. It's the eastern half of Missouri and on up into Michigan and Minnesota and those areas, Illinois. Basically, they're at a very high risk, it shows, of not being able to provide enough electricity during extreme weather times. You're in MISO, which is kind of, again, the tan or orange area, which basically says that you have potentials of energy shortfalls during extreme peak periods of the summer and winter. And that's starting in 2026, I believe. The number's small, 2025 now. So basically, what NERC is saying is that starting this year, you'll have elevated risk of not having enough generation to meet high peak periods in the summer and winter times. Finally, I'll show one more from the recent study that was done by NERC, and this really shows reliability and reserve margin. The Southwest Power Pool had a 12% reserve margin. In other words, we're going to look at the peak periods and try to have 12% more electricity available than that peak period in the summer and in the winter. They increased that to 15% back in 2023, and that's the red line going across this chart. What you see coming down from the green and blue line is basically the electric generation. The reliability or the reserve margin has been dropping. It started in 2019 at 24%. Now it's dropping down to where in 2026 you'll be looking at basically meeting the 16% or 15% reserve margin, and then it drops off quickly on into 2029. I apologize for the numbers being so small on this chart, but basically it's saying that at the point not too far in the future, you'll drop below the reserve margin that Southwest Power Pool is requiring because of retirements of existing generation. How much has retired over the past 6 years in the Southwest Power Pool? 15 power plants have closed, 1 nuclear, 7 natural gas, and 7 coal plants have closed. That's in the last 16 years. It's 4,700 megawatts, enough to power 2.2 million homes. Furthermore, in the next 6 years, Southwest Power Pool, another 9 plants are scheduled to close. Utilities have announced these closures or retirements, which will equal another 5,700 megawatts, or enough to power another 2.4 million homes. These are the plants that are scheduled to retire in the future. As you see, 3 of those are Kansas, the Lawrence, Lasange, and Jeffrey stations. And then at the far right, it shows the retirement dates of these plants. This year, starting the Harrington plant in the Panhandle of Texas, we'll look at closing. Also, we're looking at Sheldon plant, the North Omaha plants as well, looking at closing next year. So there's a number of plants still scheduled to continue to close. We are hoping under the new administration, some of that will be pushed back for reliability reasons. The other thing to be concerned with, I think, is the replacement. Basically, this is looking at Southwest Power Pool at what new generation is coming online between now and 2030 over the next 5 years. And you'll see that it's 87% is either wind, solar, or battery storage, or it's called a basically hybrid, which is the yellow, the 14%. A hybrid is basically just wind with battery backup or solar with battery backup. So there's about only 13% of the new generation coming online showing in the Southwest Power Pool will be base load, whether it's nuclear, coal, or natural gas. What's really hit us over the past 4 years have been environmental regulations. We've had 7 of them, as you can see. We had what we called Black Thursday, April 25th, 2024, where we got hit with 4 major environmental regulations, all targeted at coal fuel generation and power. This is something that the utilities have had to grapple with. Some of these come into effect as early as 2027, 2028. Others, like the carbon rule, is in 2032. But again, as utilities have to look out 10, 15 years and plan in the future, getting hit with all of these on coal plants has made a real difference in what they look for as far as the future is concerned. We do hope under the current administration, some of this will be at least re-examined. A number of these legislations, especially the carbon rule, I think has been challenged in court and will be looked at before the Supreme Court as early as April of this year. Not only on the federal level, but there's a number of states that you'll see that have passed zero carbon regulation. These states include, for the ones that are in the Southwest Power Pool, Louisiana, Montana, New Mexico, and Colorado. And currently, just happened the other day, Southwest Power Pool expanded to the west to include several states in the west, and one of those being the state of Colorado. Here's a map showing where the Southwest Power Pool is currently in the light red, and then the expansion to the west into Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona in the west. Again, one thing to keep in mind, when you expand the power pool, you're interconnected with all the generation in those states. In Colorado, they have a rule that said they'll be 100% fossil fuel free by 2040. Currently, they have 31% of their electricity is coal. Another 27% of their electricity is natural gas. So if they're planning on closing 58% of their electric generation by 2040 and replacing it with non-carbon or intermittent generation, maybe they can bring some nuclear power online. I'm not sure, but keep in mind when you expand to these states, some of them had laws in place that require them to be carbon free by a certain date. The other thing that we're running into causing part of the crisis is the delay in building new generation. I want you to focus on natural gas. You'll see the red. Basically, red is canceled projects. Over 10,000 megawatts of natural gas generation has been canceled over the last couple of years. There's delays when you look at wind generation. There's over 11,000 megawatts of wind generation that's been delayed over 12 months, partially because we get a lot of the components for wind generation from China. COVID obviously set us back for 4 years or several years on a lot of these things. And so we're not getting the components in as quickly. We're also not able to get permitted under the prior administration, permitted, sited, and constructed as far as natural gas generation is concerned. So we've had a lot of them that have just totally backed out and canceled their projects. We still do have, when it comes to natural gas, 133 new natural gas plants either in the siting or the permitting or the early construction stages. So what this chart shows is just around the country where they're looking at building natural gas plants. I throw this up there to say that if all 133 power plants come online, you can expect the price of natural gas to go very high. Keep that in mind as a fuel source for your state. We have fracking, we have other things that have lowered the price of natural gas, but this is going to be a tremendous drain on that. And trying to get the pipeline sited, trying to get the permitting done has been very tough over the last 4 years. I expect the permitting to be somewhat expedited under the new administration. The permitting process, the pipelines, and that sort of thing should be moving forward, hopefully a little quicker than the last 4. Also, transmission lines. We've had a tough time siting transmission lines over the last 6 or 8 years. There are some that are being built. I think there's about 1,400 miles that were constructed last year across the U.S. But there's a lot needed, and it's been very slow, not just because of the construction, but the litigation that goes along with siting transmission lines, especially high voltage transmission lines have had difficulty in getting built. You're looking at usually in the 7 to 12 year range, or I guess I put 8 to 14 year range, I think is what the NERC study said to get a high voltage transmission line built. On top of that, you have increased loads. Economic development is coming back ever since COVID ended, and we've had the AI that's been a large boom. This is in the Southwest Power Pool, and it shows historic peaks in the summer and historic peaks in the winter, and it shows that continuing to grow and get larger and larger. So trying to meet these peak loads is another challenge that you'll have moving forward. I did mention AI, just a couple of quick things about it, but FERC has stated that it might increase its growth of electricity needs in the U.S. by almost 5% over the next 5 years. Currently, it would be expected to grow by 38,000 megawatts of generation. That's 38 1,000 megawatt gas or coal or plants that you would need to cover that, or nuclear. Small nuclear module is being looked at as well. We currently have 2,700 data centers across the U.S. that take up 4% of all the electricity in the U.S. That's expected to grow to 6% of the electricity in the U.S. by 2026. I'll touch real quick on some Kansas specific information. This is a look at the average cost of retail electricity across the states. Kansas is 13% below the national average for electricity, which is good. You're also below the cost in Colorado, your neighbor to the west. However, you're above, as you can see, 15% above Oklahoma and 17% above Nebraska. But it's kind of a look at 2023 and the average cost of electricity in states and neighboring states. You hear a lot about adding more wind or solar will lower the cost of electricity, and I'm not saying this is correlated, but all I did was really show in Kansas, the gray line is coal fuel generation that's decreased over the last 15 years, and the price of electricity is the blue line going up that's increased over the last 15 years. So just the idea of closing coal plants and building a new generation will lower electricity rates, I feel like is not always the situation. This is a fuel cost price of gas and coal for the state of Kansas over the history of since 2012. What I wanted to show, and really it goes back 2 or 3 decades, the price of coal is very steady. It always has been. It's very low cost. The price of gas fluctuates up and down. It can be very low. It's pretty low currently, but it can go up like it did in 2021, depending on the supply of gas and the need for that gas. Again, these are the plants in Kansas, the 5 generating coal plants. And you'll see that the Lawrence 4 and 5 is looking at closing in 2029, Ascend in 2031, and Jeffrey in 2033. And Evergy can correct me on those numbers. That's what I got off of EIA. But again, those are the dates they're looking at. Of course, you have the Holcomb plant and the Nearman Creek as well. I did not see a closure date on that. I'll finish up by showing some environmental advancements for the state of Kansas. You've done a great job. These are coal plants in the state of Kansas. They've lowered sulfur emissions by 97% since 2001 through 2023. Actually, it dropped rapidly all the way down to 2016, 2017, and it stayed relatively the same. Also, with NOx, or nitrous oxide emissions, they've dropped 88% during that same time. So you've done a very good job. Now, some of this is because of controls on the coal plants. Some of it is because you've closed the coal plants. So those are the emissions drops, and some of that is because those power plants have gone away. But some of it is because they've added additional environmental equipment. One more I'll show is basically carbon dioxide. Again, we feel like there's not going to be, there has been under both Obama and Biden a CO2 goal and regulation that they pushed for. The latest one under Obama was actually 52% reduction in CO2 by 2035. As you can see from the 2005 levels, that's kind of the standard where they set the CO2 regulations based off of 2005. You can see in Kansas that you have lowered your CO2 by 52% already, and it's not anywhere close. We're still a decade away from 2035. So Kansas has dropped CO2 dramatically over the last 20 years. The thing that I would say is part of this, again, it's because of closure of coal or gas plants, not necessarily putting any equipment. Carbon capture equipment is very expensive. You have to have a place to store CO2 underground. I'm not sure Kansas, it probably has some places where it would work. They do use CO2 to pump into the ground and a tertiary recovery of oil. They do that a lot in the Permian Basin in Texas, where you push CO2 into the ground. It brings more oil to the surface. There's opportunities like that in certain places, but it's not everywhere. So for the most part, it's very hard to look at regulating or capturing a gas that every time we exhale CO2. It's the same CO2 that comes out of a power plant. It's no different. So anyway, we feel like that Kansas has done a great job on environmental issues as far as coal fuel power plants. I'll end with my favorite cartoon, which is the Roadrunner. And I think to some extent, some states are headed for a disaster on their energy situation, electric reliability. I commend the state for passing a bill last year. I think it falls short in a couple of places, but it was a good start. And I would, at the risk of shooting myself, I would open it up to questions.
Thank you, Randy. Committee, further questions? We're going to start with Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I enjoyed that very much. A couple questions, if you don't mind. Could you just talk just a little bit about the carbon rule? I understand what it is. We're trying to reduce it, but can you say a little bit more about it?
Sure. CO2 in the atmosphere supposedly helps, I mean, it warms or causes global warming. When you look at the US's share of that CO2, it's about 3% of the world. China by far is the largest emitter of CO2. As most of you might have heard, China's building a 500 megawatt, average of a 500 megawatt coal plant every week, not every month, but every week. And they don't have the controls on those. So we have been seeing concentrations of CO2 have been rising in the atmosphere. What we've found is that as far as the US is concerned, we're a very small amount of that. It does come from natural gas as well. A gas plant will emit about 50% of the CO2 that a coal plant will emit. There are 2 plants in the US that capture carbon currently. One's down in Houston, one's up in Tennessee. Those 2 plants have been, you can use CO2 for a number of things. Actually, in eastern Oklahoma, they capture some of the CO2, and Tyson's uses it to flash freeze its chicken. So you can, it's the same as dry ice and other things. You can use it for other products as well. It's just that the enormous amount of CO2 that comes out of a fossil fuel plant, it's hard to capture all of it. But the rules that are there basically say currently, which we feel will be rolled back or will be nullified by the US Supreme Court, but the current Biden administration calls that a coal plant has to install carbon capture by 2032 or close the plant. So it basically put a death knell for coal plants by 2032 is what.
And one more question, if you would, please. We're looking at building 2 natural gas plants here in Kansas. And you said, that, you know, the more that are built, 33 are being looked at, the more the price of natural gas could go up. But the state of Kansas, I believe, is rich in natural gas. So couldn't that be a positive for the state of Kansas?
I think absolutely. There's 133 being built across the US, but yes, I think you're rich in natural gas. The one thing that you don't have in legislation that I would say is that before you close a coal plant, you have the gas plant up and running. It doesn't, and we found in a number of states, I'm not saying Evergy or anything in Kansas, we found in a number of states, the utility signs a consent decree with EPA or with the Sierra Club or someone saying, we're gonna close a coal plant on this date. And they fully expect to have the gas plant up and running and going by then. But they run into gas pipeline permitting issues. They run into other construction issues. So they don't get the new plant built in time. And they've already signed a declaration with EPA to close the other plant.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Next up is Representative Berquist, and you were with us up in Wyoming also a couple years ago.
So, hey, thank you for being here. Wanted to ask you about the efficiency or the performance of the plant we visited in Wyoming, the coal burning plant.
Sure. The Dry Fork plant is a mine mouth operation, so the mine is sitting right next to the power plant. It has what is considered fluidized bed combustion, which is very high efficiency in its generating capacity. And so it runs somewhere in the 92 to 93% constantly. A lot of coal plants fluctuate up and down, but it is touted as the lowest cost coal plant in the nation because of its efficiencies and because the fuel supply is right next door.
And as far as carbon emissions,
It, it has carbon emissions, as you know, on top of the power plant when you were there, Representative. You see nothing coming out of the stack. That there's no sulfur, there's no nitrous oxides. EPA has 6 criteria health-related pollutants for air. CO2 is not one of those. So it did have carbon emissions. I can go back and look at how much CO2 is coming out of the stack, but it was very, 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 very clean. It had scrubbers, it had bag houses, it had electrostatic precipitators. It was in pretty good
it's a
shape.
fascinating trip, and we appreciate your time in doing that and in being here today.
That's sponsored, by the way, by the state of Wyoming, so.
Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Randy. It's been a few years, so welcome to Kansas.
Good to see you again.
Yeah. So I just wanted to clarify something, and you may have alluded to it, but maybe I missed it. But when you were talking about the SPP expansion into Colorado and Wyoming, Montana, and so forth, I was kind of taking your explanation that somehow that was going to affect the original SPP footprint, but there's so few gateways between the western interconnect, which Colorado is in, and Wyoming and so forth, that there's really not a lot of power exchange that goes on. I mean, those gateways are full anyway, so there's not a lot of back and forth going on now. Did I misunderstand something there, or?
No, you're right. I
Okay.
think the key is that they're planning on building several more interconnects in and out. Now it takes a little time for that to take place, but I guess the thought is Colorado's in such a tough situation that they're looking for states like yours or Nebraska or Missouri to be kind of the battery or the backup when they can't meet their load that they're looking at.
That'd be years, probably.
Sure, yeah,
Okay,
it'll be
so
several years.
by the time those
20,
interconnects
30,
get
yeah.
built. But anyway, okay, I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Other questions? I'd like to call on my ranking member, Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Randy, for being here for your presentation. I guess my question actually was, Representative Smith asked it with respect to the carbon rule. You actually indicated that the Obama administration actually had up to 2032 for carbon capture for coal plants. Isn't there like new technology that some of these plants can actually adopt to actually meet that particular goal to 2032 to actually capture some of the carbon that's being emitted?
There is, excuse me, yeah, and that's under the Biden administration, and there is technology there to capture carbon. It's very expensive to capture the carbon. It has to go through a chemical process to be able to trap it. The problem is on top of that, where do you put it once you trap it? You have all this CO2. Now, there are some places that have saline aquifers deep down in the ground. It just depends where your plant is. They are building some CO2 pipelines at looking at transporting CO2 to areas of oil fields where they're depleted and could use that CO2 to bring more oil. There's other places where they're looking at piping it to an area where they could put it underground and store it. I guess the concern is basically, if you're going to put CO2 underground, how long is it going to last? You run into a lot of the landowners above, do I want CO2 stored? Even though it's maybe a mile down, you run into some of that. You have the wells that have to pump it down, that you're going to have regulations. So there's a lot that has to go into storing the CO2 more than just capturing it.
I'll stop there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Any further questions? Okay. Randy, when we were out there, and I think another individual here alluded to it, but we toured the experimental coal power plant, not the mine, but the electric plant. Weren't they using like a anhydrous ammonia catalyst or an azine, I believe it is, NH3, to do a catalyst per function there that knocked out, I heard 98, 99% of the particulates coming out of that.
Yes, there is they do have a small scale. 5% of the CO2 from the plant is captured, and they run through different experiments. They're looking at taking actually CO2 and bringing it into a brick form that can actually be used as a building material. There was a number of things, but the chemical, the anhydrous ammonia, is a chemical way of stripping the CO2 from from the emissions. And so there's recently they've been given additional grants. There's a lot of really Japanese companies that are very interested in the different ways you can capture carbon, what you can do with it. I mean, if you look at carbon fiber that they're using now for building airplanes and other things, it's CO2 basically, it's concentrated. But carbon fiber is becoming a new material that they're looking at carbon as well. There's a lot of things out there. I think basically you're just going to have to try to get the cost of it down. Excuse me.
Yeah. And then you're part of the National Energy Council.
I am.
So we met up in North Dakota this past summer and had some good tours up there as well concerning carbon capture, what they're doing up there with the pipelines bringing it in. But there was also some testimony or discussions up there of using the carbon as maybe an enhancement in the fields or maybe soybeans and stuff. You remember anything on that?
Yes, I was not in I didn't make the North. Oh, wait, is that Grand Forks?
Grand Forks.
I was there. You're right. I'm sorry.
Your twin brother was there.
Where am I at? Yeah, it is actually put in soil now to help grow plants. The Holcomb plant here in Kansas looked at one point growing algae with the CO2, capturing the CO2, growing algae, using the algae for a fuel. Fuel-based, they can use algae and convert it into a petroleum-based. So there's a number of things going on with how you can use, and you put a number of the people do in their agricultural practices add CO2. They've shown where in laboratory experiments in the Carolinas with poplolly pines, if they put it in an area and pump CO2 into that area, and it has a higher concentration of CO2, the pine tree grows faster. So they've done experiments with higher CO2 inside of elements, greenhouses.
I had another question over here from Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation today, sir. I'm sorry I've been a little in and out, got a couple of things in the irons in the fire. But I've looked through your slides and I've heard a little bit of your testimony. Thank you for doing that today. You're talking about the coal aspect of it. I see that there's a small component of our portfolio, about 5%, that comes from nuclear. Is there any space that you've heard of for an interplay between coal technologies with nuclear being more expansive, taking over more of the portfolio for the long game? Is that something that we're considering as well?
Oh yeah, I don't know about Kansas, but nationwide, the AI facilities, especially the data centers, the Googles, the Amazons, they want to try to be carbon free. And to do that, one way of getting reliable electricity that's carbon free is nuclear generation. So they are looking at what are called now, they had small turbines, which were 300 megawatts. Now they have what's called micro turbines they're looking at that are only 50 megawatts, which could power Topeka, a small town, something like that. So there's a lot of research. I see a real explosion of nuclear generation. They're even looking at repowering 3 Mile Island now. So.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. The chairman is a very smart and intelligent individual. He raises a level of play for everybody on the committee. So I had I had to go research a few things dealing with nuclear on the off season. And the reason I asked that was 3 Mile Island is basically secure, safe technology. But I think one of the things that I'd like to see is we make Kansas great again and be a leader in our coal distribution of energy, is also to get that nuclear piece going as well. And I would always be open to any conversations that you want to have to figure out how we become a leader both in those technologies that deliver it, but also support that industry as well.
Nope. Any further questions? Randy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Next up is Chris Berger here. There you're. Okay, I was trying to find you over there in the crowd. Chris is an attorney with Stevens and Brand LLC, I believe in Lawrence. And I got your information from the speaker, Dan Hawkins. He said you had some really good insights on eminent domain.
Well,
So I thought, come talk to us.
well, that's much appreciated. My name is Chris Berger. I'm an attorney with Stevens and Brand. We're a law firm out of Lawrence, Kansas. Still affectionately refer to ourselves as a nice country law firm, although we seem to grow. As a lawyer, I always have to say, I'm not actually here on behalf of anybody. I'm not representing anybody. I'm not here on behalf of a client. This is purely my experience. This is my personal beliefs and opinions. The areas of practice that I have: construction law and eminent domain. And there's a very small handful of lawyers in Kansas that are committed to eminent domain practice, probably 6 or 7 in total. Graciously, I'm one of those individuals, primarily representing utilities who take from people, but I also represent owners who have things taken from them. And that gives me, I hope, a useful and unbiased insight into the whole process. So I apologize for what might be either too simple or too complex. I actually love eminent domain and the whole process, and I find it fascinating. So if I start talking about commas or something of that nature, feel free to glaze. I'll come back to something which is a little more interesting in a moment. So eminent domain is the situation where the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says nothing may be taken by you, the government, without just compensation being paid to a property owner. Kansas has adjusted that through our own constitution to allow for just compensation and damages. As lawyers, we find that fascinating. The Eminent Domain Procedure Act was then put into place in order to define what the procedure had to be in order to take something from people. Now, you as the state are the only one empowered to do it, but as the state, you have granted that power to private companies through statutory grants. In our case, 17-618, which allows for, electrical, gas, any variety of private utility, or I should say public utility, but private company that is a public utility, to exercise your power as the state to take things from people based off of your legislative belief that that's necessary for things like heat and electricity and water, which are essentials to the world. The act was originally created in the turn of the last century, was amended in the late 1960s to create its current version. And I'll say that as an act, think in terms of what you can do as the state. You can come in and just take something from someone, and that really can leave property owners absolutely on their heels and unable to protect themselves, right? That's not an unfair kind of overgeneralization. But the way the act was created is a 2-tier process, which I'm going to say on behalf of condemning authorities and property owners is really an excellent approach to it. It's set up so that the first step is an administrative process known as an inquest, meaning that whatever comes of that, other than the dollars that have to be paid to those property owners, has no precedential effect. I view that from the context of if a utility comes in and takes someone's property and the value is determined to be zero at the end of the day of that person's property as a result of the taking. A bank, for example, is not allowed to then run in and say, my loan is under collateralized. That cannot happen. The same way that if the property owner has their end value determined to be, $8.5 trillion or some unreasonably inflated figure, the county appraiser is not allowed to come in and say, I'm increasing your property taxes. So the only thing that matters in that first part of the process is how much the condemning authority, whether it be KDOT, whether it be the gas company, the electric company, will pay to that property owner. And it's determined by a panel of 3 people who are all local to the county, which sounds very generic, but I'm telling you is brilliant. Because as someone who stood in front of dozens and dozens of these panels, those individuals, not just 2 of the 3 have experience in the valuation of real estate, but especially as we move into smaller communities, we all know each other, right? And there's been several instances that an individual either is awarded more or less based off of what is known about them and their practices and their existence. A very fair kind of process, and 2 things. And I'll say that without exception, every panel has always put their thumb on the scale on behalf of property owners, as it should be. Occasionally they run away, and it's a crazy number. And occasionally it's on the wrong side, and it's a very minimal number. But in those situations, the act is set up for a second set of processes, which is an appeal to the district court for a full-fledged civil trial with appraisers and experts who will come in and determine what the proper valuation should be, not by those 3 individuals, by 12 jurors, as it can and should be. Kansas elected in the late 60s to adopt this 2-tier process, which I'm telling you is a lovely balance of the efficiency of needing property with the protection of a property owner, and in some instances, ratepayers, as the case may be. But there were other options that were available. And I'll say, you can make changes to the Eminent Domain Procedure Act. There are plenty of people who will, myself included, who will have things to say as to what can or should or what will be better or what will be different, or you want to put your thumb for owners or condemning authorities or whatever. But right now, it truly isn't broken. And yes, you can do more, you can do different, but it is very functional and it's very protective to the people who need to be protected, which are the property owners. Kansas elected in the 60s to take this 2-tier approach. They could have done something different. There are fast takes where the government literally just comes in and takes it, and then years later figures out how much gets paid. There are also situations where you have to go through a full administrative process of getting appraisals, of making offers, exchanging back and forth, negotiating, et cetera, which can add months, if not years. Because I'll tell you, as I go into different counties and smaller counties, finding appraisers, we can talk about the employment gaps, way to call it. People aren't going into appraisal like they did. There are fewer appraisers than there were. Appraisers are if they do their job correctly, it'll take at least 2 weeks for each appraisal. And on a condemnation, a utility will be potentially condemning dozens, if not over 100 different tracts. So there are some, Missouri being one, who says we want a full-fledged appraisal for the taking for each tract of land, that gets negotiated and discussed and exchanged, which in Kansas, I'm afraid, would be an impossibility with who we have available to us. So I appreciate the opportunity to just kind of come in and have a little extemporaneous conversation. I was informed yesterday of this. I don't mean any disrespect on not having a PowerPoint or anything of that nature. Just wanted to give a larger overview of things, and unfortunately I could talk forever, so I will stop. And if anyone has any questions, I would offer to answer those here or privately, whatever the case may be.
No, I appreciate you coming in here. I'd like to call on Mr. Carmichael. I think you may have some experience in this too, don't you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The opportunity to cross-examine with leading and suggestive questions a Stevens brand attorney is one that I cannot pass up. And as our chairman will assure you, I am capable of taking a simple question and making it last 10 or 15 minutes.
Could you repeat that question?
I am very, very capable. Yes. At any rate, I want to get back to some just more basic proposition. You talk about appraisers and 3 people, quote unquote, from the community. Ultimately, who decides how much the property is worth?
On the 2 different processes, the first part, that administrative process, which is about a 60-day window from the date of the filing of petition to when the award is paid in, is determined by 3 members of the county, 2 of the 3 of which have experience in the valuation of real estate. They are then have a public hearing at which there is a presentation by condemning authorities, property owners, and then they go into the smoky back room, so to speak, and come out, and their number of a before valuation, fair market value, and after value, and the difference between those 2 is the amount that the property owner is paid. So it's those 3 individuals who determine it. If people are dissatisfied with it, either side can appeal, and then it's going to be a battle of professional appraisers and 12 jurors who will listen with as much thrill as the audience right now is and yourselves as to all of these details and make a decision.
Oh, this committee loves to hear this kind of thing. Now, then what we're oftentimes concerned with here is a circumstance where the entire property is not actually necessary for whatever the public use is. We're not talking about building a highway where we occupy 100% of the ground and presumably the air above it. Rather, we're talking oftentimes about electrical transmission lines where some would say you can still farm underneath, and others might claim that cattle die of EMF-related radiation, but it's not a whole taking. Can you address that circumstance and how, if at all, that is different from if the city says they're going to build a street through my house and they bulldoze the whole thing?
Absolutely. So there are 2 types of takings. There is the total taking and a partial taking. The Act addresses it very well. As the state, y'all the only ones that have the power for a total taking, a fee, what we call a fee simple taking. That's the title to the property. The state will own it forever. The grant the state gave to utilities is for for easement purposes only. So an electric utility or a gas line can only take an easement on a property, and an easement is limited to a right to use that property. Now, that article that was circulated, perhaps fascinating, I'm sure, but it kind of pokes a little fun and kind of shakes hands with Justice Stiegel in a concurrence he had to an opinion where he came out and said, the majority here thinks that takings, that we should simply trust the government, and his response was, I'm not so sanguine, to believe that necessarily the right thing will always be done. So to address that easement question, that is entirely on the condemning authority. A condemning authority can come in with a ham hand and simply say, I'm taking rights and stuff. In which case, that 3-person panel uses that language and must use that language and value it according to the words that were used. So if I come in and I take something from you and I just say, I got the right to do all this sort of stuff anywhere on your property, well then, that really effectively becomes a total taking. But if I come in and I specifically say, I am taking this particular right over this particular area for these particular things, and I take the extraordinary step of saying, and just to be clear, you still have the right to farm and to run cattle and to do X, Y, and Z under it. Well, that not only is the right thing to do, but is also protective of the property owner and reducing in the amount of the award. So yes, we can do, I'll throw the blame on the condemning authority lawyers who simply come in and don't take the mental effort to limit what they're doing. And I'll throw the blame on the property owner lawyers who don't understand that. At the end of the day, though, an easement only takes part, and it is valued accordingly, hopefully with a proper condemning authority that is not just limiting what they're doing by expressly stating that. I think it's the best practice to also say what remains in the land so there's clarity.
I appreciate that explanation. Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, I'd like to ask one additional area quickly, my friend. Valuation. Typically, we think of the value of a property as what a willing buyer would pay and a willing seller would accept without coercion, duress, etc. But obviously, when there's eminent domain, the process of willing buyer and willing seller has apparently not worked. Elsewise, they wouldn't have to go through condemnation. They would have just made a deal and gone on down the road. Does the law allow for any additional compensation, and I don't want to call it bonus compensation, but to the unwilling seller who now has the beloved family farmhouse destroyed because there's a power structure placed in the middle of the home, or just the enjoyment of the swimming pool, perhaps, or these sorts of things. Because I know there's legislation now floating around here that says we're going to pay people who are forced to sell their land or an easement over their land, we're going to pay them more than what it would be in a simple two-party transaction absent coercion. Presently, does the law allow for that bonus, if you will, and that's the wrong term? And tell me your thoughts about what impact that might have on condemnation in the practice.
So Missouri, for example, allows, I think they call it a heritage payment, which is where if there's a property which has been in a family for multiple generations or has that kind of historical tie, that there is a multiplier applied to what the award is. Kansas has no such tool for it. Kansas addresses that in a different fashion, though. It does not it does not factor in the compelled nature of things. It still requires it to be a determination of value from well-informed buyers and well-informed sellers in an open market. So it acts as if, and the panel acts as if this is a voluntary sale. So what's it really worth in the market? That's the before fair market value. The fascinating part, fascinating, right? Talking about statutes. The fascinating part is that the after amount is called the value. Difference between fair market value and value, which up until 2018, no one really cared about. But the Supreme Court against Eagle, of all people, came out and said, that's a meaningful difference. Fair market value is what it appraises for by appraisers. The after value, the value is whatever value is determined by the panel. That can be by normal appraisal methodologies, or it can be things that are we can call them hereditary, we can call them crazy, we can call them anything which has some basis in fact, however, with believable evidence. There's not been any challenge as to whether or not these hereditary sort of multipliers would count within value, but there have been plenty of evidence and there's been plenty of argument in front of panels for that sort of thing. Sometimes it resonates with the panel, sometimes it doesn't. It really, like I said, I've found to both fear and trust panels at the same time. You never really know, like I have no idea what any of you are thinking. I have no idea what they are thinking. But at the end of the day, definitely more than 75% of the time, they get it just plain old right. Whether it be an intangible, like the history of somebody's, love and interest in the land, or somebody lying about their love and interest in the land, as the case may be.
But if the legislature in its infinite wisdom decided that as a matter of statutory law, if the government or its designees, like perhaps a transmission company, electrical transmission company, comes in and involuntarily makes me give up my land or at least an easement, could we, as far as you know, constitutionally appropriately say, just as a matter of law, you're not going to pay 100%, you're going to pay 150% because it's an involuntary taking, and we think that's what's fair. As far as as you know, could we do that if we chose?
I think that works off of a false presumption, which is that there's anything but an involuntary taking. That's the whole idea of the Fifth Amendment, is that it is a taking and just compensation is paid for it. I've never seen anyone who had something taken from them that wanted it taken, because that's the whole idea of eminent domain and takings and condemnation all being the same thing. As far as your authority, I don't know. I mean, I suppose you could always redefine whatever you want to redefine as just compensation or damages.
I must have misunderstood, because the takings clause, as a constitutional matter, says that when the government takes private property for a public purpose, the owner of that property is entitled to just compensation. But as far as I know, it doesn't preclude the government through the legislature saying, not only are you going to pay just compensation, you're going to pay more than that. We're going to say you pay 150% of what is just. Couldn't we can do that, I believe, if we think that's the best thing.
I'll say you can always pass whatever legislation you want to pass. Whether it then follows with constitutional muster would be a different question.
Counselor, I'm sorry, we disagree on this particular proposition.
Could you repeat the question?
But Abraham Lincoln said that a lawyer's time and advice is his stock in trade, and I appreciate you sharing yours with us. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Representative Carmichael.
That was good discussion. Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Berger. Is there any difference between when eminent domain is exercised by the federal government as opposed to state government?
I've never done a taking on behalf of or against the feds. I don't know. I only think about the state.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions? Not seeing any there. I believe I've read through the statute you'd mentioned earlier, 17, I think 6-618.
Right.
It's been a while back, but I think the last time it was opened or updated was 1964. Does that sound about right?
That's probably generous. That it came about in the late 1800s. The very first right that's granted under it is for macadam roads. And in fact, the Supreme Court of Kansas referred to it as a kaleidoscope of rights that is difficult to understand.
So with the thought of how old that is, in your opinion, are there items that we may want to take a look at to update the statute? Things that are no longer valid, or because it seemed like there was even comments or write-ups on for like the delivery stables and stuff.
Right. I mean, it talks about, tube and cable, and I mean, all sorts of waterways and very, very antiquated ideas. Just from a practitioner point of view, I would say that all condemning authorities, with the exception of like truly private companies, non-utilities, have opinions out there that say they can use that statute for the state's grant of rights. And that if you start fiddling around with that language, you will open up to just new litigation and lawyerful employment. You can choose that, I suppose, but.
Okay. Any further questions? Not seeing any. I really appreciate you coming over.
You all very gracious. Thank you very much.
You'll hang on to your phone number in case something comes up. So, all right. Committee, that is all of the testimonies for today. Next meeting is on Tuesday, January 28. We've got Kat Moyer from Pioneer Communications coming in. She's going to update us on rural broadband. And we got Dana Reith from Cuyahoga Oil and Gas Industry for discussion. So is there any questions or comments before I close her up here? We're not seeing any. We are adjourned. Thank you.